Okay, time now a minute after 8 a.m. On the December 8th, 2022 in Japan Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo online morning seminar organized by the team in Tokyo. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. In our morning seminar programs, we try our best to capture the periodical flagship report. Poverty and Shared Prosperity Report is one of them. 2022 edition was released on the October 5th. We had the pleasure of having the authors of the report connecting with us from Washington. Let me very briefly introduce two of them. First, we have Jet Freeman, who is a lead economist in the deck of the World Bank. Jet, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Koichi and everyone. It's an honor to be here.
Great, thank you very much. And we also have Yonso Kim, who is a senior economist in the World Bank, being a part of the team who put together the report. Yonso, good morning. Thanks for joining.
Morning, Koichi. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. We received some questions already from the viewer. Thank you very much for sending your question. If you did not have opportunity to send your question, please do so by sending your question through the online form which was posted on the announcement page of the seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. So I'll read your question after the keynote presentation by our speakers. With that, I'd like to ask Jet and Yonso to come in formally to start your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Koichi and everyone. Again, it's an honor to be here. It's a start of a day in Tokyo, and it's the end of a day here in Washington, D.C. But I trust Yonsu and I have enough energy to have a good discussion with you today. And we'll be talking through an overview of the 2022 Poverty and Shared Prosperity Report, which is titled Correcting Course. And I think the title will become obvious once we see the content of the report. The Poverty and Shared Prosperity Report, or the PSPR, is the World Bank's biannual update on global poverty and shared prosperity. And I had the honor of co-leading it this year with Ruth Hill, one of our key colleagues who unfortunately cannot be with us now, but we're very lucky to have Yunsu Kim, who is a core contributor to the report and who will ably fill the shoes for Ruth today. So the Poverty and Shared Prosperity Report is an update on global poverty, and then it's a policy deep dive into a particular topic, and the topic this year is fiscal policy. So I'll take us through the first part of the report on the update, and then we'll give the floor to Yunsu to talk about some aspects of fiscal policy that we look at. And we'll try to keep it to 40 minutes. So Koichi, please let us know if we're going to go long with this. There's a lot of material, so it's hard to pick and choose. So I hope we'll stick to the time. But to begin with an overview of, I would say, maybe three main messages of this report. We see them here on the screen. The first message is clearly that the COVID-19 pandemic has dealt the biggest setback to global poverty reduction efforts in decades. Now, progress towards poverty reduction was already slowing, beginning in around 2014, and then there was a dramatic increase in 2020, and we believe now, with the recent challenges in particular, the 2030 target of extreme poverty reduction is effectively out of reach, and the world will have to now deal with the inability to attain SDG 1, which is most likely to occur. Secondly, 2020 also saw the first increase in global inequality in decades. Income losses for the world's poorest were roughly twice as large as income losses for the world's wealthiest. And then the economic recovery since the start of the pandemic has been very uneven, with some of the most lagging growth in low-income countries that exacerbate some of these differences. And then finally, of course, the magnitude of these setbacks calls for a major course correction. Now, recovery will depend on a wide variety of policies, monetary policies, trade and regulatory policies, and so on. Clearly, fiscal policy can also play a role, as this report focuses. And reforming fiscal policy is one essential element of correcting course. And indeed, highly ambitious fiscal efforts that we'll show you at the end of this presentation may overcome the recent setbacks we've seen in 2020, but they alone will not help reach the 2030 target. And in fact, while fiscal policies focused on redistribution, particularly, might help to eliminate extreme poverty in upper middle income countries, there's a critical need to spur growth in low income and low middle income countries to eradicate extreme poverty. We don't believe that a redistributive focus of fiscal policy alone will achieve that eradication. So with that in mind, let's turn to the first part and the next slide. Thank you, Yunsu. This just gives you some background leading up to the recent crisis period that we all lived through. Many of the slides today will focus on poverty assessed with the extreme poverty line of $2.15 a day. This is using the latest PPP update with the 2017 PPP, which has now shifted in nominal terms the extreme poverty line from $1.90 to $2.15. But in real terms, in many ways, the value of this line is the same through time. But if we begin with the recent history of extreme poverty reduction, beginning in the period when these are largely survey-based estimates, roughly 1990, we see the world experience dramatic gains in poverty reduction. In around 1990, 1 in 3 people in the world lived below the extreme poverty line. In 2019, that was less than 1 in 10. And most regions saw a reduction in extreme poverty, but there were dramatic gains, first and foremost in the East Asia region, driven by the 3 decades of growth in China, largely, and to a lesser degree, also very important gains in South Asia. I just want to note that if we look at the light blue line at the top of the figure, for much of it, Sub-Saharan Africa experienced much slower rates of poverty reduction and finished the year 2019 with an extreme poverty rate of around 35%, the highest of all regions. And to give a sense of the latest 2019 official poverty counts in the World Bank's Poverty and Inequality Platform, which makes up the data behind much of this analysis, Yunsu, if we go to the next slide, please, we have this map at the country level, which clearly shows the distribution of extreme poverty around the world. Obviously, for much of the rich world, there's negligible amounts of extreme poverty at the 215 a day line. That's not the case for low and low middle income countries, of course. And we see that the highest extreme poverty is indeed in Sub-Saharan African countries, and maybe even focused in the center of the continent, in that geographic cluster of the darkest blue. So that's just a bit of scene setting. Now let's turn to what we see happened in 2020, where we come to this global shock we've all lived through, which clearly marks a turning point in the recent 30-year history of global poverty reduction. Now, first I want to note that the rate of global poverty reduction was already slowing in 2014. As you can see, this is now the year-on-year change in global poverty rates going back this is going way back to 1950. From 1990 to 2020, this is mostly survey-based estimates. And before 1990, we were relying much more on growth adjustments to get estimates of poverty change. But as you can see, beginning in 1990, there was pronounced poverty reduction. It started to slow around 2014. And then the contraction in 2020, of course, we see the incomes of the poorest 40% fall by 4%. Increasing the total number of people living below the international poverty line by roughly 70 million people. And indeed, now the poverty headcount rate stands 1.2 percentage points higher than we would have projected in 2019 before, of course, we had this global contraction due to the COVID shock. Now, if we want to look beyond 2020, going to the next slide, we see that 2021, we did see a partial recovery. However, projections for 2022, as what we can see now in this orange line, so this the solid line is the historical record. The dashed purple line on the bottom is the projections we expected before we had the emergence of COVID. The orange line is our current projections. And we see that 2022, we're basically on pace for very little change in global poverty, as global growth prospects have dimmed due to relative price changes in food and fuels, partly in response to conflicts such as the war in Ukraine. Now, should note that relative food price inflation can indeed, in the long run, might have some beneficial effects, but in the short run, since the poor spend a larger fraction of their budget on food and other essential commodities such as fuel, these relative price changes are expected to hit them harder in 2022. And indeed, if we want to account for these relative price changes, then we would forecast a total reduction in extreme poverty in 2022 of 5 million people, placing 2022 as the second worst year in the global poverty reduction record, only after 2020, looking back, say, over the last 40 years. So these challenges persist. Now, everything I've discussed with you has been at the global level, and of course, global numbers are principally influenced by events in the most populous countries, India, China, and so on, of course. So another way we can look at it is to explore impacts in each country separately, which is what we do in a summary form in these histograms, where we literally count the number of countries, first by low income status. These are the three bars on the left, lower middle income status, the middle three bars, and then upper middle income, the three bars on the right. We literally count for 2020 the number of countries that experienced a poverty increase. And indeed, we see virtually every low or middle income country saw an increase in poverty in 2020. Now, there are some exceptions. Brazil is one notable exception that had a very strong policy response in 2020 through cash supports that actually saw poverty in 2020 decline. But that's the vast minority of cases. Most countries saw an increase in poverty. And then we see that poor countries are slower to recover. If we look at low-income countries, 11 out of 27 of the low-income countries in 2021 reported a further increase in poverty over and above 2020, and a full recovery in only 6. Recovery in LMICs and UMICs slightly better. Nearly 3/4 of LMICs reported some resumption of poverty reduction in 2021. But still, recovery was not strong enough in more than half of countries to reach the 2019 levels. So, at the country story, huge increases, not just in the most populous countries, but quite broad-based, and then with limited recovery, especially for the low-income countries. Now, if we want to turn to the second major point, which is on inequality, and specifically global inequality, we see here that in this inequality figure, this is now the annual change in the global Gini year by year. Again, since 1990, largely based on household survey records. Before 1990, more reliant on national accounts inferences. But what we see is the same story to the poverty reduction, at least for the recent period. We see a rather extended historical period of convergence in global incomes, with large declines in global inequality, say around 2020 and going forward. And again, that convergence rate actually slows down again in 2014. And then we come to the COVID year, where we see global divergence to a large degree, as the world's poorest were hardest hit. And then these diverging fortunes, of course, between the global rich and the global poor, ushers in the first rise in global inequality in decades, and arguably, by these estimates, perhaps the single biggest one-year increase in global inequality since the end of World War II. It's hard to say that with certainty. The historic impact of this year is again quite apparent. Now, as I said, global inequality is as a global figure is largely driven by some of the most populous countries. So we also look at inequality change at the national level, and there we see a much more mixed story. While remember, in 2020, virtually every country saw an increase in poverty rates, that's not the case for inequality. Some countries experienced an increase, those in red. More countries actually experienced a decrease in inequality over this period, implying this mixed picture, basically implying that global inequality is largely a between country story, not a within country story translating into global changes. Divergence, again, the more well-off countries, high-income countries, upper middle-income countries to some extent, and then relatively larger shocks in low and low-income countries. Taking it all together, the events of the last 2.5 years have set back global progress on poverty reduction, as we said, effectively placing this 3% goal out of reach. We already saw the projections even before COVID. Global poverty in 2030 would be 6.5%, and now it'll be even higher, almost 7 percentage points. The 3% goal was difficult to achieve before the crisis period, and there's clearly an urgent need to correct course. Now, I want to say, and this already came up in some of the questions we received, that these projections mask substantial heterogeneity across regions. Actually, we project every region in the world, including South Asia, will likely meet the 3% target by 2030, with the exception of Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan African regional poverty should remain well above the 2030 target, and by 2030, maybe still it'll be at around 30% in 2030. And for that region to achieve the 3% target in this relatively short time frame now, as a whole, it would have to achieve growth rates roughly 8 times the magnitude of the growth rates that the region has witnessed from 2010 to 2019. So it's quite a tall order in Sub-Saharan Africa, and as a result, the world will miss the 3% target, most likely. So I just want to, before turning to fiscal policy, I want to mention 2 core things. We've largely focused on monetary poverty at the extreme poverty line of 215. But of course, the costs of the crisis go beyond monetary costs, and they extend in many dimensions, including premature mortality, quite a bit of lives lost prematurely due to either directly due to COVID infection or indirectly brought on by the COVID pandemic and the policy response. And just as importantly, in many ways, a great challenge to the world in terms of lost learning, as formal schooling was closed to some degree in virtually every country and in many countries for extended periods of time. We don't want to lose sight of these impacts as well, beyond monetary poverty. For example, we note other work that shows that in 2020, for the first time since 1945, the world experienced for the first time since 1945, the world experienced a decrease in life expectancy. And so what we do for a diverse set of 60 countries, we try to contrast the costs of the pandemic period in terms of lives lost early, in terms of learning loss, and in terms of the poverty increase that also showed, or that we focus on largely in the first chapters of this report. And we try to do this through one common metric, namely years of life. So either expressed in terms of years of life lost to premature mortality, for if we die early below life expectancy levels for our country, we can consider that to be a years of life lost that might have otherwise been experienced. Or we could think of years of life lived below the poverty line. So let's focus here on this figure just to the right, and specifically on the potential cost of learning loss. Now, to translate learning loss to an increase in years of life, total years of life lived in poverty, we can estimate the impacts of the lower stocks of human capital due to learning loss, if indeed this loss is not remediated, and how this loss affects the course of future economic growth through a long-term growth model that includes human capital terms. And then we can project out these growth differential, let's say through 2050, and look at the implications in aggregate for the poverty experience. Because of course, if every year the poverty rate is slightly higher due to lower growth, due to learning loss, then we will have an increase in the total years of life lived under the poverty line. And we can compare this increase, let's say, in the poverty experience through 2050 with the poverty experience we measured for 2019 and 2020 and 2021, the discrete shock of the COVID period. And that's essentially what these figures are doing on the right, where the purple is the increase in years of life lived under the poverty line per 100 people for 2020 and 2021. And we see, of course, that it's about an increase of 6 years of life lived under poverty for each 100 people in low countries. It's a bit of a U-shaped pattern. It gets to 0 for high-income countries, and that's largely because high-income countries on aggregate had robust responses to the contractions in 2020, and there was no net change in poverty in countries. If we want to then the implications for future poverty due to lower learning and how that might affect growth, these are these green points and what the takeaway is essentially for every income category, the potential cost of future poverty due to learning loss exceeds the discrete poverty costs that we've experienced in 2020 and 2021. Now, that's not to say, of course, that this is happen. Policy can intervene to remediate these learning losses, and hopefully this is a future we can avoid. And indeed, that's part of arguably correcting course. But we did not want to lose sight of these important consequences beyond the monetary poverty there. And finally, one other point I want to make before turning to the second part is that, if we can move to the next slide, Yansu, please. While the results focus again on the absolute poverty line of 215, the extreme poverty line, we consider, of course, additional poverty lines. The World Bank has alternative poverty lines for higher income countries that allows the reference level of welfare to shift. So the extreme poverty line is essentially the median poverty line for the 27 low income countries. That's the 215 line we see in this figure. We also have a lower middle income poverty line of 365 with the new PPP estimates, an upper middle income line of 685, and so on. This figure succinctly captures nicely the distribution of national poverty lines across a wide range of countries, as well as where our income category poverty lines fall. I just want to conclude with one key takeaway from looking at these other lines, and that reminds us that the 215 line is really an extreme lower bound for welfare sufficiency. It's an important line, but it's not the only one, and that the higher lines in the lower middle and upper middle income countries also represent a significant degree of deprivation. For example, the upper middle income poverty line is 1/4 the value of the high income poverty line. And at this still relatively low level of reference utility, roughly half the people in the world, 47% in 2019, more so in 2020, live below this reference. So as we make progress on poverty reduction, we don't want to lose sight of the fact that poverty, as reasonably defined by many of the countries in the world, is still a major challenge. And with that, I want to thank you very much for this quick overview. I hope I confuse anyone, and I'll turn it over to my colleague Yansu to review some of the lessons we have from the fiscal policy deep dive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jed. I hope you can hear me. The first part that Jed has presented has hopefully made a good argument, a convincing argument, that course correction is urgently needed. The second part of the report discusses what type of policies can help us get back on track. And among the many different types of policies that are part of the government's toolkit, this report focuses specifically on fiscal policy, which has been at the center of discussion over the course of the pandemic, with impacts on growth, poverty, and inequality. I'm going to focus on 3 key lessons and what they mean going forward. So the first key lesson is that the fiscal response to COVID-19 protected welfare, but less so in low and middle income countries. In the report, we examine how fiscal policy was used during the first year of the pandemic, specifically in order to protect poor and vulnerable households. The response was historic at scale around the world and happened in many different forms, such as cash transfers, which were particularly widely used, and wage subsidies, among others. And what we see is that fiscal policy did a lot. Poverty would have been 2.4 percentage points higher without it, but the size of the response and the resulting level of mitigation varied tremendously across countries. High-income countries were able to offset the increase in poverty, and in some cases, income for poor households actually ended up increasing. But it was much less protective in upper middle-income countries, where the mitigation was only by about half, and in lower middle-income countries and low-income countries, where the increase in poverty was only mitigated by about a quarter, which is what you see on the figure projected on the screen. And this was mostly because poorer countries lacked the access to finance that was needed, and also struggled with weaker social protection delivery systems and highly informal labor markets that made it very difficult to identify the workers whose jobs needed to be protected. The second key lesson is that in many ways, the pandemic response reflects the pattern that was already there before 2020. The PSPR brings together fiscal incidence analysis from 94 countries to examine the role of taxes, transfers, and subsidies on households across the income distribution. Taxes raise much needed revenues for the government, but they reduce the incomes of households. And it is possible, however, to offset the impact of taxes on the poor and vulnerable households by using transfers and subsidies. And in high-income countries and upper middle-income countries, this is done quite well. And in fact, transfers and subsidies are large enough to offset the impact of taxes on poor households, and their incomes increase when taxes have been paid and transfers and subsidies received. On the other hand, in lower middle-income countries and low-income countries, this is often not the case. Poor households, after they have gone through the fiscal system, very often they end up having less income after taxes have been paid and transfers and subsidies have been received. There are two primary factors behind this. Poor countries rely a lot more on indirect taxes for revenues, which are less progressive. And they spend less on transfers, which are much better targeted to the poor, while at the same time, they spend just as much on subsidies as richer countries. The figures here are shown for subsidies and cash transfers. The left figure shows by country group and household income level who receives the cash transfers and subsidies in the country. And on average, 20% of spending on subsidies goes towards the bottom 40%, compared to 60% of spending on cash transfers, meaning that cash transfers on average are much more likely to go to the poor. On the other hand, about half of total spending on subsidies goes to the top 20%, of the richest. And the right figure shows how countries spend fairly equally on energy and agricultural subsidies. If you look at the different bars, the dark green bars represent the share of spending on energy and agricultural subsidies, and they tend to be of fairly equal height across different country groups. Whereas poorer countries tend to spend less on social protection, the spending of which is represented by the light green bars. Assessing the full welfare impact of policies requires thinking about who benefits from fiscal policies, as well as thinking about the value of fiscal policies. And raising revenues is costly, and it's generally hard to do well in poorer countries with highly informal economies. So the money raised, we want to make sure that it is spent well by financing well-targeted and high-return policies. And this can be depicted conceptually in two dimensions. As you can see in the figure, we have the share of benefits going to richer versus poorer households, and you have the value of the policy. And fiscal incidence analysis, as we have seen in the previous slides just now, they help us understand who is benefiting from the fiscal policies. And we would like to have another framework for thinking about the return to spending. And here we use the marginal value of public funds framework, the MVPF framework, as a way of valuing policies. It is one way to do this, and there are other ways to do this as well. The MVPF framework asks specifically which fiscal policies give the largest bang for the buck by comparing short and long-term benefits to all those affected by the policy, And this includes the direct as well as the indirect beneficiaries of the policies, and comparing that to the net cost of the policy to the government. So, for example, as you will see in a little bit, an MVPF value of 2 indicates that a $1 investment in a specific fiscal policy generates $2 of total benefits. This framework has largely been used in advanced economies, particularly the US, but here in the report, we work through an example for cash transfers and subsidies in developing countries. Cash transfers have a return of around 1 to 3. That is what the findings in the literature show, depending on the context. And the returns tend to be higher when the transfers help households invest in schooling. The schooling channel tends to be the largest channel of impact when it is there, as well as it helps stimulate the local economy and also increase government revenue through the collection of indirect taxes. On the other hand, as you would see here, another example that we have is on energy subsidies, which have a return of less than 1, mainly because they offer limited long-run benefits and they also have limited positive spillovers. So the question here is what policies would be in the top left quadrant, meaning that a larger share of the benefits would go towards poorer households, as well as policies that have a higher value. And this brings us to the third key lesson, which is that some of the highest value fiscal policies have high long-run returns, but they can also be sometimes hard to prioritize. So what it shows is that the investments that pay off the most are the ones that also have long-run impacts. For example, investments in health and education, the benefits of which tend to materialize over the long run, as well as investments in infrastructure and R&D. The challenge is that the benefits of these policies accrue in the long run, which can make them hard to prioritize, particularly during crisis times. Even though, as we have seen, protecting high-value spending could help maximize the welfare impact of fiscal policies over the longer term. So what are the implications of this going forward? So there are 3 of them here. Number 1, reorient spending away from subsidies towards better targeted support that also can have a larger impact on growth. Number 2, don't neglect to spend for the long run, even when there are current pressures during crisis times, for example. And number 3, when revenue mobilization is needed, do this in a way that does not harm the poor. Examples of this include property taxes, which still tend to be very much underutilized in developing countries, as well as new forms of progressive taxes, such as carbon taxes, which help reduce emissions with little impact on GDP, employment, and inequality, as the literature currently shows. And there's also the example of health taxes, which more recent literature shows that they can be progressive when you account for the benefits over the lifetime. In low income and middle income countries, the governments may have to rely on indirect taxation in the short run because of the highly informal nature of the economy, but they would have to think about how the negative effects could be offset potentially through direct transfers to the poorest. And so this brings us to the final question. This type of better fiscal policy that we're advocating for in the report, does it allow for the course correction needed? So for this, we go back to the projections that Jet ended with in part 1, and we look at what an ambitious package of fiscal policy reforms could do, which would entail increasing growth and or increasing the redistributive role of fiscal policy. And the left figure shows the different trajectories of global poverty if better fiscal policy were to be adapted across countries. And in all of these scenarios, fiscal policy would help recover the losses in 2020, but in none of them will it be enough to get us back on track to end global extreme poverty by 2030. On the right-hand side, looking a little deeper, we see that different types of countries face different implications of this. On average, fiscal policy has more impact in upper middle income countries, which are shown on the through the 3 bars on the left in the figure. And a focus on redistribution can be particularly impactful. The higher bars here mean that more countries in that income group would reach pre-COVID levels of poverty forecasts by 2030. So higher bars mean they're much closer to getting back on track. On the other hand, fiscal policies have less impact in poorer countries. And in addition, there it is more impactful when it boosts growth rather than redistribution, relatively speaking. And here's the final slide with the main messages of the report. Yeah, I mean, these are pretty much the same slides that Jed has started with at the beginning. And with this, thank you very much for listening, and I will hand it back to Koichi.
Thank you very much, Jed and Yonso, for presenting the main point of the report, Poverty and Shared Prosperity 2022. We received several questions from our viewers in advance, and also we received a question just before the seminar started. So let me read the question that we received in advance. First one, question from Mori-san. Thank you for your question. After the launch of the report, what kind of reaction did you receive so far, particularly from leaders, officials, and academics from developing countries? So this is the first question. Any comment, Jed or Yonso, please? Thank you.
So yeah, thank you, Koichi, and thank you, I believe, Mori-san, for the question. And before addressing that, I just want to mention that the report itself is very in-depth in many ways. It's like 350 pages long, and we did our best to sort of present an overview of topics. But I urge any of the audience members, if they're interested, to download the report and read at their leisure. It'd be good reading to help go to bed at night. But I think if any of these topics on global poverty or fiscal policy are of interest, we hope that the report will be of use. So I urge everyone to look at the report in more depth if the interest is there. And thank you. So now reaction, we launched the report. I can't believe it's 2 months ago. It feels like yesterday, given everything that's happened since. And I would say, I mean, leadership in general, I think the messages were expected in this report. I mean, we knew it was a very difficult period, and so there was nothing, there was no surprise in that regard. But I think the report was very soberly taken by the policymakers we spoke with. And the reactions sort of depended on where the audience was sitting. So certain wealthy country audiences saw it as a call to action to think about how best to use international engagement and support to help overcome these recent challenges, while bearing in mind that there was a whole set of challenges that were there in 2019 that are still there as well that need to be addressed. And among low-income settings, I think, again, I think the focus on growth was well appreciated by several of our constituencies with the World Bank, as well as, interestingly enough, a lot of people really resonated, or a lot of reactions we had to the multidimensional aspects of poverty. I think there's a growing appreciation that poverty is beyond monetarily based measures, and this report tries to address that in terms of reporting on multidimensional poverty as well. So I think that by and large, the report was received as welcome, sobering, and yet another sort of piece in the call to action for global poverty reduction, and the need to start thinking about reorienting policies and programs towards those that are maybe more effective, those that we can focus on longer run returns. So there's a lot of discussion about how to protect successful policies and programs that really don't pay out in the short run. And that really gets into an area that this report didn't engage with. We sort of said, these things are likely to be important for poverty reduction, and then we stop on the how. And I think many of our audience said, okay, that's very well taken, but how? And that, of course, is in and of itself a huge topic of discussion that relates very much to political economy issues that might be very country specific as well. So, we had this struggle writing a global report trying to present issues of global import, and trying to give examples of successful policy courses, without being able to really be very tailored in policy recommendations because of the global nature of the report. So anyway, Koichi-san, I hope that helps convey our experience of the reception of the report till date.
Great. Thank you very much for your response. Next question from Sasaki-san. Thank you for your question. During the pandemic, the rollout of the vaccines to developing countries was seen as a vehicle to stimulate economic return and stop people falling into the poverty. Is it still the case?
Thank you, Koichi. I mean, I can try to tackle this question. Because we were thinking about a similar issue starting about a year ago. I mean, it's been almost 3 years since the pandemic started, and the issue of vaccine access seemed probably a lot more relevant in perhaps the first 2 years of the crisis when vaccines were scarce, and so there was a time when they were considered almost as prerequisites to opening up the economy, and there was a push, as you might remember, to achieve population immunity by rolling out by having a huge rollout of vaccines. A lot of things I think have been learned along the way, and a lot of things have changed. It has been a very dynamic past 3 years. I think one lesson that we have learned is that vaccine access, the issue was much more than just a supply issue, as we have found actually in some recent research also is that in some regions and countries, there are challenges also with the demand side, basically related to vaccine attitudes or vaccine hesitancy, as it is also called. But perhaps more at a broader level, the world has very much quickly evolved. And in some places, I mean, Biden has also proclaimed that the pandemic is over in the US, but people have also moved on in some ways. And while there's still some emphasis on vaccinations, it's also less perceived as a binding constraint at this point. So I think that is one thing. And then, I mean, there was the pandemic, but there have also been compounding challenges coming from food and energy price inflation, compounded again by the war and many other factors, which has made the recovery further difficult. And the global economy, just quoting the IMF, is facing a very broad-based and sharp slowdown at this point. And concerns about a global recession, we hear a lot about that these days. And in this context, poor countries are struggling even more, and the recovery was already lagging behind, even when some of the countries were already starting to recover, even at the end of 2020. And especially those poor countries that are struggling really from high levels of debt, they're concerned about implementing fiscal consolidation. And here, just going back to our point of fiscal policies, here it would be important to implement a type of fiscal policies that would, preserve growth, as it will be very much needed in these countries, but also does not harm the poor. And adding on to that, while the report focuses very much on fiscal policies, we're also back to the host of other structural issues that these countries were facing even before the pandemic, which will have to be tackled in order for them to know to increase productivity and create jobs in the longer term.
Thank you very much for your response. So one more question from the same viewers. Let me read the question. The presentation says the 2030 target of the poverty elimination is out of reach. When do you think the world can achieve this goal? Compared with the MDGs, the 2030 agenda became more inclusive, asking the private sector and developed countries to be part of it, joining the effort. What do you think would be needed in addition to changing fiscal policies by the government?
Yeah, that's a fundamental question. So just to begin, we note that the long-term projections of extreme poverty is really a function of two factors. One is the long-term projections of economic growth, and then the other is the long-term projections of population change. And as it stands now, the projections today do not identify the sub-Saharan Africa region meeting the 3% goal in ever. I mean, by 2100, and that's largely a function of wherever the best guess of long-term growth and the best guess of population growth. So so clearly that needs to change. The relative gains in the economy against the relative um, growth in populations need to change in sub-Saharan Africa. And so I think just like it was for the rest of the world, extreme poverty reduction is still largely a growth story. Um, and so when we talk about policy responses, and that includes not just direct public actions, but of course involving private actors as well, we have to really try to understand what will spur broad-based growth in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's a variety of factors. I mean, we certainly believe fiscal policy is part of the mix, but it's certainly not the only one. And I think what we try to draw attention to in the report is, again, we want to create the political economic space for governments to protect long-term investments in their own populations, for human capital, for infrastructure, things like that, that if done well, have long-term returns that translate back into higher growth rates and extreme poverty reduction. And so I think the international community has a very important role in allowing or facilitating the sub-Saharan African governments the ability to execute efficiently and well, and then to maintain long-term investments that pay off 5, 10, 20 years down the road. And that's speaking very generally, of course. And it's harder for me to get specific, and I think our audience might have ideas to their own as well. But that's sort of the 30,000-foot answer to that critical question, as far as I see it. I don't know if Yunsu, you would like to add to that.
No, I think that was a great answer. Nothing further from me. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your responses. We received a question from the anonymous participant. Thank you very much for sending your question always. Let me read some of them. The first one, regarding eliminating multidimensional poverty, does it mean health is covered by parameters of water and sanitation, or does monetary poverty covered nutrition? So question about the health and nutrition in multidimensional poverty.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think, there are various approaches to the measurement of multidimensional poverty. And the World Bank in 2018 put forward one approach, which is complementary to other approaches, such as that adopted by UNICEF and the UNDP. And the grounding of the World Bank approach is still very much in the economic world of consumption-based measures of well-being, but recognizing that many critical aspects of consumption are provided through non-market goods. So, quite frankly, the public provided education is a key dimension of consumption that the household uses, as well as, of course, investment, and that is largely not captured in our monetary measure. So another key aspect in many settings is the non-market provision of health services. So I think, which is the spirit of the question, and it's very well taken. The problem, of course, for implementing a multidimensional measure is we need to observe the same dimensions for each unit of analysis. So in a simple case, for a household, we need to observe consumption measures, education measures, health measures, and so on. And if we want to do that systematically across the sweep of our constituent countries, we're actually quite limited by data. So the World Bank multidimensional measure currently only encompasses public services such as water, sanitation, electricity, since that's measured fairly consistently for 160 odd countries at the household level. Education, access to primary level education, and not other dimensions, such as more direct dimensions related to healthcare access or to healthcare outcomes. So, I think this is largely a work in progress, and we don't want to imply that this multidimensional measure is comprehensive in many ways, nor is any multidimensional measure arguably comprehensive, since none of them really include environmental services, which is also key. And we go into some detail in the 2018 PSPR on this. So I'd urge the audience to look at Chapter 4 of the 2018 PSPR that I hope has a clear discussion on this. But it's a point well taken. I think the literature on multidimensional poverty is still developing, and we're contributing to it, but we have a longer way to go. And I don't believe the current measure that we use perfectly or adequately captures the health dimension. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The same participant raised a question related to taxes. So let me read the question altogether. What kind of support does the World Bank offer to developing countries to introduce and enhance the personal income tax, corporate income tax, or taxes on capital gains? Do you have any suggestions for OECD countries to take this course? And then the participant continues saying, the report says the new international corporate tax infrastructure is projected to yield little additional revenue. Do you have good ideas as a way to reform and reduce the international tax avoidance? What is your suggestions to make fairness of the trade structure? So any comment from Jet or Yonsu on these points? Thank you.
I can take a go and maybe you can come in, Jet.
Sure.
Sure. So I think the first question was on implementing progressive taxation, and what the World Bank does. So I can't speak to what all the individual OECD countries do, of course, but just in general, the bank for its client countries, there are many different ways that they support the countries, right? We have the development policy loans, which support reforms, and certain reforms, they're designed to help improve the progressivity of taxation. There's also various TA, which is technical assistance to increase tax administration capacity, public finance management, but also an important part, and actually a part that is increasingly, I think, growing. A growing part of our work is the knowledge or analytical support that helps to understand how different population groups are impacted by either individual fiscal policies or by the fiscal system as a whole. And that is actually the fiscal analysis incidence tool that I was referring to in the presentation earlier, where I said this type of analysis, we have it for 94 countries. And that is actually, that was not just done over the past year, that is actually an accumulation of work that has happened over actually more than a decade, I think. And there's increasingly more recognition and demand for this work. Governments seeing the usefulness of this and seeing where exactly, who exactly is benefiting from the various fiscal policies and how progressive or regressive the different policies are. And one reason why this is also important for governments is, in addition to, of course, understanding what these policies do for households of different income levels, is that for political economy purposes, right? If you want to push through a reform, you have to think about the political economy of it. And if you think of subsidy reform, for example, an important part of it is maintaining public support for the reform, and which comes together with one part of doing that is making sure that those that are impacted the most, from the withdrawal of the subsidies, especially the poor, that will feel it a bit more than the original. So it's making sure that they're adequately compensated, and this part of understanding and intervention can potentially come from a better understanding of this. On the second question, which was in the report, I think. So I'm not an expert on this, I will say, but just looking at what we had, just thinking of what we had put in the report, an important part of why that global agreement is projected to have little benefits, is projected to help little in terms of additional revenues. I think there are two important reasons for this. One is that, as the report I think also says, is the high level of exemptions, and that goes. It appears that goes for this particular tax measure, but in general, tax exemptions are usually highly regressive, and they don't help revenues. And there's a lot of foregone revenues coming from tax exemptions. And I think there's a discussion in the report as well. Another is that in the low income countries and lower middle income countries, the additional revenue from corporate income taxes is projected to be little. And I think this actually goes back to the high levels of informality in these poorer countries. And so I guess while this might be a step in the right direction, probably this is to say that a lot more effort, including global coordination and research, will be needed on what further might be needed for this.
Thank you very much. We received a question from Professor Shimamoto from Kyoto on the YouTube screen. So let me read his question. What is your assessment on the global assistance, such as ODA, OOF, PF, I think project finance, upon the poverty reduction? So this was a question put together by Professor Shimamoto. I'll ask Jet or Yonsu to come in. Probably this will be your final remarks before wrapping up our seminar. Thank you.
I can quickly come in so I've actually not looked at ODA overall, but we've looked at ODA financing for refugees and internally displaced. Actually, it's part of an ongoing war. It was actually quite interesting. And there are a couple of lessons I think that stood out. We've actually looked specifically at what happened to ODA during the pandemic. And I think one lesson is that it's still very ad hoc. And that there was a trend which was not very positive even before 2020, but we see a fall in refugee financing, I guess financing for displaced populations in fragile countries. We see a fall of ODA, especially in 2020. We have not seen 2021 data yet, so we're hoping to see an uptake when the data comes out, which understandably comes from, I guess, all the countries around the world having to shift their own finances towards support to their own populations, among others. So one issue is that the financing, ODA financing, tends to be less stable over time, as well as it also tends to be very short term, from what I understand. There's very little multi-year, longer-term financing, and it tends to come on a year-to-year basis. It's difficult also to predict, which makes it even more difficult for the receiving countries, to plan out how much they're receiving and what they can use it for. So I think it's just a conjecture, of course, on my part. There are probably broader lessons that will be applicable, I think, for broader ODA as well.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent response, Yunsu. Thank you for that. And I would just add that, of course, understanding the effectiveness of aid is a long run question. I mean, a long-standing question that we've looked at, and there's actually very little definitive evidence around these. I recently did a review in the World Bank Research Observer on effectiveness of project financing, investment project financing, and that's it's very hard to link a particular project to key outcomes such as poverty reduction and so on. So I think we have to address this question much more along the lines that you've raised, Yunsu, in an aggregate level, and that speaks to the whole governance structure of ODA and other development financing at the country level. And again, making it easier for these countries not just to access such financing when needed, especially at times of crisis when they need to protect key systems and there's budgetary shortfalls, but also coordinating and such so that there are regular flows so that, again, we can facilitate countries to make longer term investments in their population. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This morning, we had a pleasure of having Jet Friedman and also Yonsu Kim, both of them from the team who put together the Poverty and Shared Prosperity 2022 report. Their presentation was posted on our website for this seminar, and also the same website seminar, the announcement has the link for the report, so you might be able to download the report from our website too. With that, once again, thank you very much for your time and presentation this morning. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We do have one more seminar today, actually, starting at 12 p.m. In Tokyo time. we are going to feature Dolte Verna, who actually is in town in Tokyo today. She is going to present her latest report on insect farming in Africa as a possibility for the alternative source for the protein. This will start at 12 p.m. In Japan Standard Time. Please check our website for the detailed the announcement. You can join us at the venue, but also you might be able to watch the seminar via YouTube live streaming. With that, once again, thank you very much. Stay safe, stay healthy, and see you later, actually, this afternoon. Thank you.